Hello and welcome to this week's Cyber Panel. Today I am joined by a fantastic array of guests. Welcome to all of you. Today we're going to be discussing cybersecurity ahead of the Digital Transformation EXPO.
If you could all introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about what your company does, that would be a great start.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Nicholson. I'm the Director of Security Services at a company called Bridewell Consulting, and we specialise in cybersecurity consulting. We have a security operations centre, and we also conduct penetration testing companies across the globe. We're an NCSC accredited company in Crest as well, so we operate within central government quite heavily.
My name is Tushar Imam. I'm the sales manager for Comsec UK, which is part of Comsec Global. Comsec Global is one of Europe's longest standing cybersecurity consulting organisations. We're HQ out of Israel and have been defending our customers' IT systems for over 32 years. Our services coming from Israel, we believe in being strong in defence and strong in offence.
Hi, my name is Richard Agnew, so I'm VP EMEA for Code 42 Software. Code 42 Software is a data loss protection company focused on protection for endpoint laptops, effectively, stuff that sits outside the firewall and cloud services, data moving between endpoints and cloud. We're particularly focused on insider threat, people inside the organization who are accidentally or deliberately exfiltrating your intellectual property out of your organization, which is a major talking point in the cyber world at the moment.
Thank you. Last but not least.
Yeah, Dan Pitman, so I'm a security architect. I work for Alert Logic. We're a security services company fundamentally, so we provide lots of technologies to detect threats and catch the bad guys basically, and then we contact our customers and help them through how to get rid of them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for joining us today. So let's get to it. What are the biggest trends that you've seen in the last 12 months in regards to cybersecurity?
I'll go first. I think from my own perspective and what we see across our clients and in the industry, I think the traditional type threats around social engineering are still very prevalent. I think recent reports such as the Ponemon Institute cost of a data breach articulates is still sort of a quarter of attacks are caused by human error. I think just the way in which they're conducted and the evolution and advancement of how those attacks are conducted are changing. But I still see sort of phishing, social engineering, human elements a major attack vector for clients. Even though there are lots of different solutions, I think still boils down to cultural awareness. And I think some of the more advanced attacks now to bypass things like multi-factor access. So traditionally, multi-factor was seen as a sort of good control to have against social engineering and password credential harvesting. But I think when you look at things like Modlishka, which is a custom-built tool to bypass multi-factor authentication, I think it's quite sort of frightening. And I think still around the user-centric human behavioural areas is quite prevalent.
That's really interesting. What do you gentlemen think? Would you agree with what Scott's just said?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Of course, security is, I think as you described earlier, an onion, but not an apple. I think the trend, I see a lot at the moment of, there's a lot of talk about sort of zero trust, the zero trust model, the old-fashioned, well, probably prevalent defense in depth model is not working. I guess I think one of the things that is frustrating that the more and more money people spend on cybersecurity protection, the reality is we're still getting breach after breach after breach. So there needs to be something new. Forrester are focusing a lot on the sort of the zero trust model. I think Gartner call it, there's some 4-letter acronym which I forget, but it's their version of that as well. And there's a recognition that I think there's a lot of focus on the bad guys being on the outside, and of course there are a lot of bad guys on the outside, we all know that as well, but there's also bad guys on the inside as well. So it's a holistic view of understanding the threats that are prevalent and how you stop data leaving your organization, which you don't want to leave your organization.
What do you think the most concerning and most challenging thing is in the industry at the moment? What have you faced?
I think it's the ever increasing lack of skills. Cybersecurity, the number of events, the systems that are out there require analysts and administrators and architects, and year on year we're seeing an ever decreasing capability for IT organizations to actually access, retain and budget for these skills. Comsec ourselves, we're trying to help by creating our Comsec Cybersecurity Academy out of Israel. But for larger organizations, they can afford to bring on chief information security officers and security engineering. Smaller organizations find it very difficult to budget for these kinds of personnel, and so are coming to us for CISO as a service, so working on a part-time basis, being their kind of security lead.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of take your point there around sort of multi-layered defenses, but I think threats are obviously evolving constantly, but I think a lot of the challenges come from the way businesses are actually working and looking to move. So when we look at things like zero trust model, is getting away from that traditional, the border network and everything sits behind the network, and how you overlay security across an agile workforce. So it's not necessarily the threats are coming from, they're changing, but the workplace is changing and it's becoming more mobile. I think if you have teams of developers, they want more autonomy over the way they work, which ultimately results in data sprawl, shadow IT. And from a security perspective, is having the technology and the skills to be able to understand those, make sure they're appropriately secured. So where we look at the DevOps lifecycle, continuous integration and development lifecycle, is how you start introducing security into those processes, because they move very fast. They're trying to build IT in a fast way to enable the business. So for organizations and security professionals, trying to catch up with that and keep them in a relatively decent place from a security perspective while they continue to grow is often a real
that's
challenge.
One of the things that we're seeing within our customer base is that everybody knows that you need to do penetration testing, and that's a point-in-time test of the surface of your applications. However, it's now being recognized that application development and testing is a weakness within IT, and we're seeing an increasing interest from customers in secure software development lifecycle training, bringing the software engineers to understand how to code in a way which helps the testing later on down the track. Okay, and also, when people have large code, to actually have, deep, secure code review of code that's built so that it's secure in the wild.
So do you think there are differences in, the size of a business and the industries on how they're actually tackling cybersecurity challenges? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
I mean, the maturity of the organisation obviously has a play, and I think the size of it. If you're a smaller organisation, you can apply a Sec DevOps, and I think the order of that acronym is important. A lot of people talk about DevSecOps, and you've got to think about security first and have it in at the beginning. But then when you get to the other end of the scale of a large organisation, there's so much pressures to advance quickly, maintain revenue, that it's not baked in from the start. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges they face, is just getting that prioritisation of security upfront, baked into the model, baked into your delivery pipeline, and baked into the thought process. We're talking about the people, and now getting a CISO into an organisation, or that thought process is really important. But often the CISO is left out of the important decision-making processes, a supporting factor in the organisation rather than a driving factor in the organisation.
I think also there's generally, I'm not saying misconception, but you often hear how security is difficult to implement for small companies who don't have the budget, and it's easy for large organizations. And I often think to myself, it's actually the other way around. Small companies, they don't have many users to secure, many processes to change. You can get technology at quite a reasonable cost. There's lots of free resources available, whereas you have a large-scale organization, yes, they have a larger budget, but how you actually go about implementing that change and those controls over multiple suppliers, different elements of the business, I think is often the reverse, really. It's harder for larger organizations to get a grip from a security perspective than a smaller organization. Whilst they might not have the same budgets, the problems and challenges are nowhere near as significant. So I think it's a diminishing excuse for myself, really, for smaller organisations to try and adopt some.
On that note, I think it's also harder for the bigger companies because they've sort of invested in stuff. They've bought some very expensive technology, they're probably depreciating it over years and years, and maybe they bought it to address a concern that actually isn't viable anymore.
Yeah.
It isn't actually prevalent. I think just going back to a previous point you made, Scott, about the sort of changing, I guess, the changing nature of work in the workforce is something I think we're seeing is that people are changing jobs a lot more often. I saw a stat that I think somebody who joins the workforce age 22, 23, sort of out of university or college or whatever, are likely to work for 10 different companies by the time they're 35. Like that's quite a staggering change compared to certainly when I was growing up. But you tended to work for 5, 10 years, and you maybe had 5 or 6 jobs in your career. So that's a common thing to do, and therefore there's less loyalty to the company, and when people leave companies they take data with them, and that's data is exiting the company through means that people aren't actually looking for at the moment. So.
And one of the things was mentioned there was around companies spending money on security infrastructure, but the problem I think a lot of organisations are finding is justifying whether they are getting value from this infrastructure. An example I'd give is the prevalence of DDoS mitigation strategies. Organisations are spending a lot of money, particularly if they're online, to put in DDoS mitigation strategies. They could be content providers or on-premises equipment, but we're talking hundreds of thousands or towards millions of pounds. But they don't have any evidence of what their capability is to actually withstand a real-life DDoS attack. We're finding with our DDoS simulation service, which basically consists of 40,000 machines located in 8 different geographies around the globe, operated by a military-trained red team, that when we go and test people's DDoS mitigation strategies, it's really surprising that the network layer volumetric attacks, which they're designed for, are working and can be demonstrated to show that they can keep their services online. But the higher level, more sophisticated services like session layer DDoS attacks and application layer DDoS attacks is actually relatively trivially simple to actually bring down people's infrastructure. So they're learning that they need to modify their modes of operation in real time to get best value out of their investments.
I think that's interesting because arguably we've solved the volumetric DDoS challenge in security as an industry, but the more complicated attacks, and it's the same in other types of breaches, people assume that you just need to put 2-factor in, for example, to solve that. But as you dig in, certainly when I got into security, my eyes just widened and widened as I realised how easy some of those more complicated attacks are. People haven't got the
one of
defences
the
in
things
place.
that I find, is when you talk about something like DDoS, people assume it's about sending millions of elements, but I can create a DDoS attack for you by talking really slowly. So I've taken all your processing power, but I haven't sent you lots of packets. So some of the methodologies aren't going to work in that circumstance.
There's denial of service attacks. They're much more complicated.
Yeah.
So how do you know when your security is adequate to match the risks? Is there a thumb point of where you can see where the mismatches are? How do you identify that?
Yeah, I think to be flippant, if you can't ask some random people what the risks and the impact of those risks are. That's the best measure for me. If you can talk to the people involved in security and they can easily articulate what the risks are to the organisation, not necessarily to a system. Okay, that system can get hacked and be breached by X or Y, but what are the risks to the organisation from a security breach? Well, you've got to start. My architecture background, you always want to go back to first principles, and that's where I think you can test how good a security is at how good a company is at security, because if they can't articulate those risks, the impact to the business, what it means at the end of the day when they get breached, then that's the challenge I think most organisations have.
Yeah, as a consulting organisation, we would just simply say, there's no rule of thumb, or guesswork about this. If you want to do this properly, you need to employ an organisation, which can conduct a formal risk assessment, understand what the likelihood of a particular attack being successful is, what the probability of this attack happening and what the impact is. That allows you as an organisation then to accrue information to understand which risks you are willing to accept, which risks you need to mitigate, and which risks you need to outsource. So it is actually bringing a formal methodology to it rather than wet finger in the air, because you'll get caught out.
I think the truth is, I think it's be naive to think your security is adequate. I think it's Forrester or Gartner, I can't remember which, said recently that if you haven't been breached, if you think you haven't been breached, you're just being naive because you have, you just don't know about it yet. So
There's
it
that
may be small. So yeah.
There's that anecdote,
Yeah.
wasn't there? You're more
Yeah.
likely to catch you're less likely to catch the common cold than you are to be breached.
Yeah,
You're more
so
likely to be breached.
if you don't think you've been breached, you have. So if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, my security's fine, then you're,
Well, that's
you're,
one
you're
of
asking
the
for trouble.
things. I used to work in similar areas itself, and you see customers saying, okay, well, we haven't been breached in 3 years.
Mm.
And you say, okay, fine, I understand. So can you tell me where in your infrastructure you're being attacked right now? Okay, which endpoints are you being attacked on? Well, I don't have that kind of visibility.
Mm.
So how can you then say from there, okay, that you haven't been breached? If you can't tell me what's happening in real time, then how can you say historically over the last few years you've never been breached? Chances are what you're telling me, okay, is that you don't have visibility. And that's where a service like yours gives you that visibility.
I think for me as well is trying to change the shift from like just the negative connotations with good security. Is like a bit of a cheesy saying, but it can enable the business to operate more securely and enable new services. And I think it's often seen as an IT issue, but it is a real business issue. And the sooner you have those conversations at the right level of the organisation to engage a board level, that actually cybersecurity is a business issue, it isn't an IT issue. And that shift is starting to move, but I think there are still lots of organisations where the board are completely disconnected. So how do you engage those? I think you mentioned about risk and impact. What would the impacts of a cyber breach be to that business? And then, it's down to us as security professionals, vendors, to educate the board on actual sort of what those risks look like and the potential impacts. And I think when you have that engagement, you can then flow down to the sort of operational areas and start to get that traction. But I think you have to start there, because ultimately when you get a data breach, it isn't the IT security analyst that the ICO start contacting and discussing with it. It's the CEO, the CIO. And I think the sooner you can get those type of people engaged, I think the better for any successful program I've been involved in has had that C-level sponsorship and involvement.
I think that's where digital transformation is helping, because it's raising the technology aspects of the business up to the board level rather than just keeping IT down in the basement. They're starting to have to understand technology, because that's what drives transformation.
I've got an anecdote here. You said that security is not an apple, it's an onion. Okay. I think security is a journey, not a destination. And we need to remember it never finishes that journey.
Yeah, I would say SEAM is something you do, not something you buy, right?
Okay, I have a question for you. If you had a magic wand to change cybersecurity in the average business, what would each of you do differently?
Well, I would actually go with what Scott said. I think this has to go up to the C-level. Data security is not just about the security team or the IT team, so it has to go right up to the top of the company. They have to treat their data, understand treat their data with respect, understand what their data is and where it lives. They have to have full visibility of that data, and they have to understand where it's leaving the organisation. So it's a top of the organisation thing.
Would you agree with that?
I think I 100% agree, and related to that, okay, is money. You can't have security without spending money, and so if I had a magic wand, I would say that organisations should be considering spending something like 12.5% of their revenue on security. And as a second ask, with my magic wand, I would say security awareness training should be mandatory for all staff in every organisation, because human beings are the weakest link.
Is that not the case at the moment then?
No.
You get the the thing we all have to do. You go through the governance training that tells you about your security and how important it is. But I think mine would be to kind of give them the benefit of our experience, right, in one go. I mean, when I moved into security, as I said, my eyes just opened and opened every day, because realising how actually easy it is to get breached, I always assumed that wrongfully that security through obscurity was a thing. I do a talk sometimes and I'll relate it to Where's Wally, or Where's Waldo if you're from the US, and it isn't. And so I'll show them the Where's Wally slide, and then I'll show them a slide with 100 Wallies on, because you're all Wallies on the internet, right? You've all got something exposed to the internet. There's probably something that can be breached in it, and the way you get breached now is quite trivial and more direct than it used to be.
That's a good way of explaining it, to be fair. Anyway, gentlemen, we have actually run out of time, but I do want to thank you all for joining us here at Disruptive Studios today and discussing cybersecurity. I've definitely learned a little bit more than I used to know. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. That's all for now. Goodbye.